They underestimated your silence. They believed that because you didn't respond, you didn't understand. They assumed your restraint was uncertainty, that your calm was weakness, that your stillness was fear. But you saw everything. You always did. And you learned something most people never learn. Words are not power. They are a substitute for it. People speak when they are afraid. They explain themselves when they need approval. They react when they feel exposed. You stopped doing all of that. Not because you had nothing to say, but because you finally understood who was worthy of hearing it. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is observation. While they filled every moment with noise, you listened. While they rushed to defend themselves, you watched their posture change, their eyes shift, their voices tighten. You noticed what they revealed when they thought you were harmless. You noticed who grew bold when you offered no resistance. And you noticed something else. The loudest people are often the most fragile. They need reactions. They need conflict. They need to feel that they can move you. Your silence starved them. And it unsettled them more than anger ever could. Because anger is predictable. Silence is not. When you argue, you give them leverage. When you explain, you give them access. When you react, you confirm their importance. But when you remain quiet, you give them nothing. No confirmation, no reassurance, no emotion to feed on. So they begin to fill the silence themselves. They project, they assume, they invent meaning where you offered none. And in doing that, they expose what they are. Some assume you're broken. Some assume you're weak. Some assume you're losing because they cannot tolerate the alternative. That you're thinking, that you're measuring them, that you're deciding. You didn't go quiet to disappear. You went quiet to see clearly. There is a difference. Disappearing is avoidance. Withdrawing is strategy. And you learned strategy the moment you realized people reveal the most when they believe you are not a threat. So you let them speak. You let them perform. You let them expose their insecurities, their jealousy, their hunger for control. And you said nothing. Because silence gives you time. Time to study patterns. Time to notice repetition. Time to separate intention from accident. And patterns are truth. That is why your silence changed everything. It removed their control. They couldn't read you anymore. They couldn't predict you. They couldn't provoke you into revealing yourself. So they grew restless. They grew louder. They pushed harder because they needed to know if they still had power over you. And you gave them nothing. Not an argument, not an explanation, not even a glance that lingered too long. Just calm. Just restraint. And that restraint told them something quietly. You were no longer available to manipulate. Your silence became a boundary they couldn't cross, a wall they couldn't climb. And they didn't even realize what was happening, because the shift wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, it was psychological. At first, they felt comfortable. They spoke over you, dismissed you, assumed superiority. But then the silence remained, day after day, moment after moment. And slowly, they began to feel it. The absence of your reaction, the absence of your need, the absence of your approval. That absence became a mirror, and mirrors make people nervous when they're unproud of what they are. Your silence became a test, and most of them failed because they couldn't help themselves. They revealed more, they tried harder, they grew desperate for a response. And you watched it all, without emotion, without satisfaction, simply noting it, because you understood something deeper than revenge. Control is not taken through force, it is taken through restraint. Once the silence settled, everything began to change. They felt it before they understood it, because silence alters the balance of power. When you stopped reacting, they grew louder. When you stopped explaining, they grew uneasy. And when you stopped seeking understanding, they began to question their control. You noticed it in their behavior, the subtle impatience, the forced confidence, the need to provoke something, anything. They wanted to know if you still cared, if they could still move you, if they still mattered. And you gave them nothing. That was when the discomfort began. Because without your response, they were left alone with themselves. And most people cannot tolerate that. You see, when you speak less, people reveal more. They fill the silence with their insecurities, their justifications, their need to feel superior. You learned who depended on chaos, who relied on noise to hide uncertainty, and who only felt powerful when someone else was beneath them. Your silence stripped that illusion away. Without resistance, their dominance meant nothing. Without reaction, their authority dissolved. And that frightened them. So they began to watch you, not casually, not confidently, but carefully. They studied your expressions, your posture, your pauses, trying to read something you refused to reveal, wondering what you were thinking, wondering if they had misjudged you. They had. Because silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is dangerous to those who rely on control rather than intelligence. You never raised your voice. You never argued. You never rushed to correct them. Instead, you allowed time to do what words never could. Time exposed patterns. Patterns exposed truth. You began to see how predictable they were, how easily provoked, how dependent on attention. They mistook your restraint for indifference. They mistook your patience for hesitation. They mistook your silence for ignorance. That was their mistake. Because while they were busy performing, you were evaluating. While they were speaking, you were deciding who was useful, who was irrelevant, and who would eventually remove themselves. You stopped offering explanations to people who were committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped justifying choices to those who never questioned their own. And in doing so, you felt something unfamiliar. Clarity. Clarity stripped emotion from your decisions. It allowed you to act without attachment, to observe without sympathy, to disengage without guilt. And that emotional distance gave you leverage. Because once you stop needing approval, no one can withhold it from you. Once you stop reacting emotionally, no one can manipulate you through feeling. You were no longer participating in their games. You were watching them play without you. And that is when they began to realize they were losing influence. Not because you challenged them, but because you no longer acknowledged them. Your silence became intentional, measured, controlled. And control, when paired with patience, changes everything. They felt it slipping away, and you felt nothing at all. Because by then, you had already moved beyond reaction and into detachment. Detachment changes the way you see everything. Once emotion loosens its grip, clarity sharpens. You stopped seeing people as they presented themselves and started seeing them as they were. You noticed how differently they treated you when they believed you had no power. You noticed who respected you only when you were useful, and who grew threatened the moment you stopped seeking their approval. That knowledge stayed with you, quietly. It didn't make you angry. It made you precise. You became more selective, more disciplined, less available. You stopped offering access to people who treated it carelessly. You stopped explaining yourself to those who had already decided who you were. And you stopped investing energy where there was no return. This is where they began to feel it most. Because people grow uncomfortable when they lose influence without understanding how. Your silence was no longer passive. It was intentional, measured, strategic. You spoke only when it mattered, and when you did, your words carried weight. Not because you spoke loudly, but because you rarely spoke at all. Silence reframed your presence. You no longer needed to dominate conversations. Your restraint did that for you. People noticed when you entered a room, not because you demanded attention, but because you didn't need it. That unsettled them, because need is visible, dependence is obvious, but self-control is difficult to read. They couldn't predict you anymore, couldn't provoke you, couldn't manipulate you into revealing yourself. You became unpredictable, and unpredictability is dangerous to those who rely on routine dominance. They tested you. Subtle comments, passive challenges, attempts to pull a reaction from you. But you remained still. Not frozen, composed. You understood something they didn't. Every reaction teaches people how to control you, so you gave them nothing to learn from. Your silence removed their leverage, and without leverage, they had no position. You were no longer participating. You were observing from a distance, detached, unmoved. That distance changed the dynamic completely, because now you were no longer part of the equation. You were the one evaluating it. You decided who remained close, who stayed peripheral, and who was no longer worth noticing at all. This was not cruelty, it was discipline. Emotional discipline, mental discipline. The ability to deny others access without explanation, without guilt, without apology. They mistook this detachment for arrogance, but arrogance seeks validation. You sought clarity. They mistook your silence for emptiness, but it was full of observation, full of judgment, full of restraint. And restraint is what separates those who react from those who decide. By now, they could feel the distance. They sensed that something had changed, that access to you was no longer automatic, that their influence had diminished, and they didn't know how to reclaim it. Because you never announced the shift. You never warned them. You simply withdrew and let them adjust to a world where you no longer needed them. That was when they finally understood. Your silence wasn't absence, it was selection. And they were waiting to see whether they had made the cut or whether they were already excluded. They noticed you spoke less than ever. But when you did, people listened. Because silence gives weight to words, and weight commands attention. You chose when to engage, when to withdraw, when to speak, and when to let silence do what language never could. They could feel it now. The shift they had dismissed at first. The distance they could no longer close. You were no longer accessible, no longer predictable, no longer affected. That terrified them. Because they relied on reaction. They relied on emotion. They relied on chaos. And you offered none of it. You had become disciplined, emotionally, mentally, strategically. You no longer reacted out of impulse. You acted out of intention. And intention, when paired with patience, is inevitable. They mistook your silence for distance, but it was focus. They mistook your restraint for hesitation, but it was control. They mistook your calm for emptiness, but it was full of clarity, full of awareness, full of decision. You had learned something irreversible. That power does not come from being seen. It comes from being untouchable, from being unmoved, from being selective. You no longer wasted energy on noise. You no longer explained yourself to those who didn't matter. You no longer chased understanding from people incapable of giving it. And because of that, you were free. Free from reaction. Free from manipulation. Free from the need to be validated. They felt it when they looked at you. Not dominance, not aggression, but certainty. And certainty is intimidating to those who live in doubt. They finally understood the mistake they made. They thought your silence meant you were fading, but you weren't disappearing. You were consolidating. Strength, focus, resolve. And when the moment finally came for you to speak, your words carried consequence. Because silence taught you what noise never could. That power is not proven through volume. It is proven through control. They underestimated your silence, and now they understand.